So what is the relationship between Jesus and Judaism in the Last Supper?
Great question. Okay, so on the one hand, some scholars have said, well, it would have been implausible or impossible for a Jew like Jesus to ever say, this is my blood, right? And then to command the disciples to drink it. Because in the Old Testament, you have all these prohibitions in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus of drinking the blood of animals. That was one thing the Jews were known for, was the blood taboo. And what I try to actually show in the book is that although that's at first glance understandable, at the same time, if you look at it a little more carefully, you can recognize that Jesus' words about drinking the blood actually only make sense in a first century Jewish context. Because in the book of Leviticus, the reason that the Jews were prohibited from drinking animal blood was because the life was in the blood, and the blood made an atonement. And as Jonathan Clawins, a really important Jewish scholar, has pointed out, by commanding the disciples to drink his blood under the appearance of wine, he's not actually breaking any explicit commandment for the Old Testament. In fact, you could make the case that the reason God prohibits Israel from drinking blood in the Old Testament, namely because the life is in the blood and the blood makes atonement, is the reason Jesus commands his disciples to drink his blood under the appearance of wine, because his life is in the blood, right? His blood is making the atonement. And so in order for them to share in the eschatological redemption and the atonement that he's going to accomplish through his passion and death, they have to partake of this new Passover, of this new covenant sacrifice in his blood. So it's one of those situations where if you dig in a little deeper to the Jewish sources themselves, you actually can find a rationale that makes sense of this otherwise shocking statement of his at the Last Supper, which, by the way, is not just attested in all three synoptic Gospels, but significantly, it's in 1 Corinthians, and widely regarded by scholars as the earliest words of Jesus that we possess. So the Eucharistic words, as they're often called, are the most ancient words of Jesus that we have, and yet they're widely neglected by scholars. So I was trying to really dig into that and focus our attention on these words by putting them in a first century Jewish context.
Okay, question 2.
Sure.
Who did Jesus think he is, based on the Last Supper?
Yeah, this is a great question. Okay, as I pointed out a little bit earlier, it's widely accepted in contemporary Jesus research that Jesus saw himself as an eschatological prophet, or as one of the sign prophets performing different signs and wonders and symbolic actions. But what we often miss is that in the first century Jewish context, there was an expectation of not just any prophet, but the prophet like Moses, going back to Deuteronomy chapter 18. And so one of the things I try to trace out in the early chapters of the book is that Jesus often, throughout the Gospels, doesn't just act like a eschatological prophet. He acts like the eschatological prophet. In other words, the new Moses. The most famous example of this would be the feeding of the multitude, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're a first century Jew and you have a prophet who takes out a great crowd into the wilderness and feeds them with bread, who's that going to make you think of, right? It's going to make you think of Moses, right, in the Old Testament. So a number of scholars have suggested that that's a Mosaic prophetic sign. In other words, Jesus is revealing his identity as the long-awaited prophet like Moses. And early Jewish sources like 2nd Baruch and other sources point to the fact that in the first century AD, Jews weren't simply waiting just for like a messianic deliverer figure or a Davidic king. They were waiting for a new Moses, because of Deuteronomy, to come and set in motion a new Exodus. So when Jesus appears on the scene and starts performing signs like the feeding of the multitude, and even more importantly, at the end of his ministry, when he gathers the 12 disciples, just like Moses gathered the 12 tribes at Mount Sinai, and then he identifies the blood of a covenant, just like Moses poured out the blood of the covenant in Exodus 24, they would have made those connections that Jesus was revealing his identity as the new Moses. And that's really significant because the new Moses was a messianic category by the time you get to the Second Temple period as well. So it's one of the lenses through which they looked at the Messiah. And so I think that's really important because if Jesus thinks of himself as a new Moses, all of a sudden his actions at the Last Supper make sense. They become clear and they have a certain explanatory power for the rest of his sayings and deeds throughout his public ministry.
All right, next question. Based on the Last Supper accounts, what did Jesus expect to happen in the future?
Okay. All right. So
it's your question.
I know it's my question. It's just I'm trying to think of how can I,
It's a big question.
Yeah,
you took a lot of pages.
Yeah, I took a lot of pages to deal with the eschatological question. So let me try to shove the camel through the eye of a needle here.
All right.
Okay. Since Albert Schweitzer wrote his famous book on the quest for the historical Jesus in the early 20th century, there's been a widespread understanding that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet of the imminent end of history. In other words, that he expected that the history of the world would wrap up, that it would end soon, either coinciding with his own death or immediately after his death. That the kingdom would come and the eschatological judgment, final judgment would set in, and the world would undergo some kind of cosmic catastrophe. And I found that compelling for a long time until I started looking more carefully at the Last Supper accounts. And what's interesting is that in the accounts of the words of institution, which again are all three synoptic gospels and Paul, at all four accounts, Jesus talks about his blood establishing a new covenant. Right? Now, if that's the case, the question becomes, well, the covenant with Moses, by the time you get to the first century and the time of Jesus, would have been in place for 1,000 years. So or more. So as T.F. Glasson points out in his little book, Jesus and the End of the World, is it really plausible to think that Jesus thought the new covenant would only last for a few hours or a few days or even a few years? Or did he, in the Last Supper, was he looking beyond his death to an interim period between his own passion and death and then the final consummation of human history, and that new phase would be the new covenant era, and that during that phase, right, he is commanding the disciples, do this in remembrance of me. In other words, to perform this memorial meal that would, in a sense, renew the covenant and also point forward to the final eschatological banquet of the kingdom of God. So one of the things that I think you can answer the question in this way, if you take the Last Supper accounts if you take them seriously, if you look carefully at the Last Supper accounts and you take into account the fact that they seem to envision a period beyond his death, then maybe we need to reconfigure Schweitzer's understanding of what Jesus expected to happen. In other words, maybe Jesus expected there to be this interim period in which the apostles would continue to celebrate this new Passover meal in his absence, in remembrance of his death, and then in anticipation of a final consummation to come.
The fourth question that you ask of these accounts in your book, what were Jesus' intentions with regard to the church?
Okay. Yeah, so again, this is one of the paradoxes I uncovered as I was working on this. It's pretty much universally accepted now that Jesus didn't, quote, intend to found the church. That's a widespread understanding among scholars that any talk of founding a church or instituting the church would be seen as anachronistic. And yet, as a number of scholars have pointed out, like Garrett Tyson and others, when you look at the Last Supper accounts in their first century Jewish context, there's a lot of cultic language in them, right? There's language that's being borrowed from the temple. For example, language about the blood being poured out. That's a weird thing to say, right? To take wine and say, this is blood, my blood, which will be poured out for many, like in Matthew and Mark. Well, you don't usually pour out wine, do you?
No.
You drink.
I don't.
Right, I don't either. No, not especially not good wine, right? But you did pour out blood, and where did you do that? Well, you did it in the temple, right? So see, we often forget that in the first century AD, the Passover wasn't just a meal, it was a sacrifice. And that according to the Torah, the only people who could pour out the blood were the priests, right? Deuteronomy talks about the blood of the lambs being poured out on the altar of sacrifice in the temple. And then also, even Jesus' language of do this in remembrance of me, that language of do this you can find it in other cultic texts, which are describing priestly sacrifices and priestly rituals and rites that would be reenacted week after week, day after day, or year after year. So a number of scholars have suggested that Jesus doesn't just seem to be celebrating a kind of like farewell meal with the disciples, where he was saying, in effect, I'll see you soon, or
right.
It was good while we were together, but now we're going to have this final meal together. No, he's doing more than that. He's instituting a new cult that is, in a sense, a replacement of the temple, right? And so if he's instituting a new cult, and if he's instituting a new sacrifice, then that implies that what he envisions is a new community, and even some scholars have pointed out a kind of new priesthood that's beginning with the apostles. Because when he tells them, do this in remembrance of me, any first century Jew would have known only the priests can pour out the blood, right? And so even the numbers of the apostles, 12, actually, this is my favorite parts of the book. So if you look at the circles of Jesus' apostles, you got Peter as his kind of right-hand man. Then you got the intimate circle of the three, Peter, James, and John. And then you have the 12, of course. And then you even have the 70 in Luke, right? And where does Jesus get these numbers, 1, 3, 12, and 70? If you go back to the book of Exodus, chapter 24, those are the exact numbers by which Moses arranges the concentric circles of the priests in Israel. So Moses, and then you have Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, these three. They go up to the top of the mountain with him. Then you have the 12 men of the 12 tribes who pour out the blood of the covenant. And then you have the 70 elders as well. So what it seems like is, this is hardly a coincidence. It seems like Jesus is modeling the concentric circles of his disciples on the priestly circles of Old Testament Israel. And if he's doing that, it seems to be the case then that he is envisioning himself as inaugurating and establishing a new Israel with a new priestly hierarchy, which will go on to be called what we know as the church or the ecclesia, the kahal, the assembly of this new Israel. So even that question of did Jesus intend to found the church, I think, can only really be answered if we look carefully at what is implied in the words of institution at the Last Supper.
So we call it the Last Supper, but in reality, perhaps the First Supper?
Might be the First Supper, yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, it really is the first in a series of many cultic memorial meals that are at the center of this new Israel that Jesus is establishing amongst his disciples, which is a pretty audacious thing when you think about it as well. Who is he to suggest that his own blood would establish not just a new covenant, but a new Israel? It really strongly points to the idea that Jesus has a messianic self-understanding, and not just a prophetic self-understanding, but really that he's the new Moses, inaugurating a new Passover, which was, of course, how the first Israel was set in motion, right? Israel was born out of the Passover, so this new Passover meal is going to inaugurate a new Israel.